This is Twit.
Now, you may remember those elaborate fraudulent robocalls where scammers actually impersonated whether the IRS, Microsoft, and other large organizations, while the Department of Justice thinks it's time to start blaming someone for letting those calls happen, and they have their targets painted. Now, as you know, fraudulent robocalls are a serious problem here in the United States, and people, whether they're saying they're the IRS and that they need to pay fees or back taxes, or maybe targeting the elderly, or maybe someone who has a really good online presence, and they're impersonating someone who is supporting a large reputable corporation to essentially squeeze money out of them, almost like ransomware-like. They pretend to be the Social Security Administration and inform victims that they have their Social Security number has been stolen or suspended, and they need to reclaim it by paying a fee. They even claim that maybe a relative is sick and it needs fast cash. Well, the question is, can you fully blame the scam artists here, or the technology and the services they use to carry it out? That's a big question here. Think about that for a second, because according to the DOJ, you can definitely hold the services accountable. Interesting. And they want a New York federal judge to cut off the company's access to the U.S. telephone network. Now, in one case, they actually had issued a restraining order against one of the companies. Now, this particular example is interesting. Over a 23-day period in May and June 2019, defendant tollfreedeals.com connected 720 million calls to U.S. numbers. Now, the DOJ says that 425 million of those calls actually lasted for only a second or less, suggesting that many were unwanted or hung up on. Now, in fact, during those 2 months, Toll-Free Deals connected 182 million calls from a single India-based call center. Now, of these calls, more than 90% appeared to come from 1,000 source numbers. Now, one of those numbers, more than 80% have been associated with the fraudulent robocalls. Now, these VoIP-based gateways between foreign call centers and the U.S. telephone network are being used to scale out the effort and mask the calls. Now, the feds don't allege that U.S. telecom providers are directly executing on these frauds. However, they say that the providers turned a blind eye. That's a big key here. They turned a blind eye to this rampant criminal activity occurring on their networks. Now, over a period of years, the companies received numerous warnings from other telecom providers that their services were being used for fraudulent use. Now, federal officials say they did as little as they could to stop the activity while the scammers continued to operate. All right. I want to first throw this out to you, the audience. Think about this for a second as we walk through this discussion. Now, feel free to tweet me or check out at twit.community and send a message. What do you think? Should services be held accountable here, or should it be only the scam artists? To put it in context, let me give you another example. Let's say somebody carries out 100,000 ransomware attacks across the country. Now, they're using AT&T Internet to do that. And over time, the feds actually warn AT&T about the actual fraudulent activity, and they do nothing. Should AT&T be held accountable for all the ransomware attacks, or should it be the actual people that actually performed the attacks? All right, all right, Curtis, I want to throw this to you first. What do you think? I want to throw that same question to you. Who should be held accountable here?
Well, I think the primary responsibility and accountability definitely has to go to the fraudulent actors. No question about that. But I think in a case like these networks where they are profiting from criminal activity, it's not unreasonable to say that they bear some responsibility. Now, the question that is reasonable is how much responsibility and how much should they be fined or punished for that responsibility. I will leave that to others. But I don't think it's entirely unreasonable to hold them responsible. The way that they're operating now is under basically a common carrier exclusion for things like this. It's the same reason so many online forums are reluctant to moderate comments, because years ago, decades ago, the FCC promulgated a rule that said essentially, if all you do is carry information, so if you are just the pipe, then you don't bear any responsibility for what that information is. It's one that the telephone companies have used, ISPs have used, and they found that everything from CompuServe in the old days to modern fora for comments, if they didn't moderate, in other words, if they didn't touch it at all, then they didn't bear any responsibility. It let people get away with 4chan-like behavior without any consequences because the owners of those forums were reluctant to do anything because the FCC had found that if you moderate at all, then you're responsible for any of the content. And it sounds like what Pi and the rest of the FCC is coming down on is saying that there's a gray area in there, that you don't have to actively moderate. You don't have to take an active role in the criminal activity going on over your network to be held at least partially responsible for that activity. And it brings us into some interesting territory because, this is almost the definition case for a slippery slope. If you're a little bit responsible, how responsible are you? If you're responsible for scam calls, are you also responsible for hate speech? These are the sorts of things that will come up as this goes along. And I'm not at all sure we have any reasonable answers for them.
I agree. I think the interesting thing here is whether they should be held accountable is that you're right. I think that they should at least be fined or have a continual infraction that causes them to, maybe not handle the one-off cases, but handle the continual cases. I kind of relate this a little bit to similarly to DMC takedown notices. A lot of times there's, people downloading movie content that's copyrighted. And eventually they get notices in the mail, and those notices usually come from the content providers. And they usually contact the ISPs and say, hey, you need to find out who this customer is because they continue to download our stuff. And, if they don't do it, if they don't actually create these notices or maybe even take those customers offline, they get fined, they get penalties, and they're huge penalties. They're big ones. And so they're so afraid of not dealing with that they actually go and have their own terms of service and other things that go along with it. So I definitely see that this could potentially become something like that, especially as you see more and more of these types of attacks come through, especially using older technology. So this interesting thing here is most of these scammers they're in small outfits, right? They're in basements, apartments all over the world. It just kind of proves out that technology is really making it easier to kind of take advantage of older technologies via gateways like telephone services and so on. Curtis, I want to throw this back to you. What do you think the industry can do here to start protecting its customers and organizations more, especially when it comes to new technology bridging old technology?
Well, it's going to be difficult. You and I both know that when it comes, you made an analogy in your initial comments between this and some of the attacks that take place via email. And as we know, there are things like whitelists and blacklists of known good, known bad DNS addresses. The telcos must have a similar sort of list. They know that there are particular country codes, area codes, where there are particular likelihood of scam calls. And I think what we'll see is a growing pressure to block at the telco level calls from those particular country and local codes. I suspect that if it doesn't already exist, and I will say now I am not an expert in current telco industry, but if it doesn't already exist, I think we'll probably see some services similar to the whitelist and blacklist services that we now see for DNS address blocks that take action against these known bad numbers. Now, if there are innocent numbers caught up in that, well, I think what that does is make it incumbent upon people in those areas to bring pressure on the local targets to shut down their business. It's fascinating. Years and years ago, when we were first setting up our household, we would go and look at houses, and once in a while, you would find a house that was just a standard suburban house, but it had, for some reason or another, 40 phone lines being brought in. And back in the 80s, it was generally assumed that what you had then was an illegal betting operation. Bookies would do this, get a house, and run a bunch of phone lines. Today, you don't have to have all of those lines. You can use VoIP. You can have a single solid broadband connection and send out millions of these calls. The cost of entry is low, and you don't have to have a high hit rate to make it insanely profitable. What we really need, and what I think the regulators are trying to do, is disrupt the profit model. And if they can do that, then it might just make telephone calls useful again and all of our pockets just a little bit quieter.
Right. Well, we do know that there's actually some new services that are coming out that are starting to prevent this. And some of these telco companies are actually distributing these services to help block these things. And so hopefully these types of scares that come with fines and other regulations will also come with some additional innovation to help protect us. But we'll have to see.